This is our first event in the year of Open 2.0. My name is Lorraine Harrycombe. I'm the Vice Provost and Director of UT Libraries, and very happy this morning to introduce to you one of our rock stars in the field, Clifford Lynch. Before I do, I'd just like to recognize Phil Long, who is here from Project 2021, who is a very significant partner with me in Year of Open. And this is, as I said, Year of Open 2.0. Last year, we had 4 speakers in our Year of Open. And the purpose of Year of Open is to bring speakers in to engage in discuss and dialogue around the open agenda. And that includes, as we did last year, open educational resources, open education, open textbooks. David Ernst, who was here last year. This morning, we'll hear a little bit more from Cliff, who in my view is a visionary in terms of this landscape, about how technology, funding mandates, policies have reshaped research, and in particular, how we manage data around this. Clifford Lynch has led the Coalition for Networked Information since 1997. CNI is jointly sponsored by the Association of Research Libraries and EDUCAUSE, which includes 200 member organizations concerned with the intelligent uses of information technology and networked information to enhance scholarship and intellectual life. So very much involved in the higher education ecosystem. CNI's wide-ranging agenda includes work in digital preservation, data-intensive scholarship, teaching, learning, and technology, as well as infrastructure and standards development. Does that sound familiar in the library world? We are very much a node in that ecosystem. Prior to joining CNI, Cliff spent 18 years at University of California Office of the President, the last 10 as Director of Library Automation. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of California in Berkeley, as an adjunct professor at Berkeley School of Information. He's both a past president and recipient of the Award of Merit of the American Society for Information Science and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Information Standards Organization. He served as co-chair of the National Academics Board on Research, Data, and Information from 2011 until 16, and he remains active on numerous advisory boards and visiting committees. So this morning, Cliff will address for us, let me give you a little background, the landscape of the research life cycle, which is experiencing a fundamental shift as technological developments change the ways in which research is prepared, conducted, and disseminated. Areas of scholarship and areas of this talk that will significantly impact the way we in the libraries especially, but other agencies on this campus, a large research campus, need to think, rethink, and prepare for new ways of working and new ways of developing services to address these very significant challenges. He will discuss the strategies for managing transformations of scholarly communications and how libraries can and other institutions support the evolution of research. So please join me in welcoming Cliff this morning.
Well, thank you. Everybody can hear good? It's really nice to be back here, and I am very happy for the opportunity to spend some time on this topic. I'm going to cover at a pretty high level quite a number of developments, and I think at least some of these developments will be familiar to people here, probably different ones for different people, but I'm going to try and knit this together into a a sort of a broader picture that I hope will be helpful to you in thinking about where things are going and some of the implications of this for libraries, for the research enterprise broadly, for your institution and beyond. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end, and I would welcome them. If I lapse into acronyms or something as I go, feel free also to interrupt, and I'll try and fill in some of those blanks. So I want to start this look in the place you really need to start, and that's how is the activity of research, the practice of scholarship, how is that changing? And I think we can argue that it's changing in two ways. One way is kind of organic and internal. The ways in which scholars in different disciplines actually do their work is changing in very fundamental ways in the last couple of decades. And recently we've seen some very significant developments kick in. And then it's also changing from the outside. It's changing because research and scholarship is something that's supported by the society broadly. And the society, which finances this essentially and makes a place for it, is changing its expectations and its understandings about what they expect from the research world. So that is changing the landscape as well, because for better or worse, reluctantly or aggressively, the research world and the practices of scholarship do need to respond to these external forces. And we'll see some very important examples of that. And of course, the interplay between the changes because the way we do scholarship is changing and changes because of the external expectations are very interesting to watch as we move forward. After we spend a bit of time on that, I want to move into some consideration of what does this mean about how we change the way we communicate and document scholarship, and how we manage the scholarly record, and how the nature of that scholarly record is changing. This is going to be a natural consequence of both these internal and external forces. So let's talk about how scholarship is changing. And I want you to think very broadly here when I use terms like scholarship. I'm trying to cover a spectrum that ranges all the way from astronomy and particle physics through the life sciences, and indeed through the biomedical sciences and public health, that looks broadly at the social sciences, and that also very clearly encompasses the full range of humanities, and even although this gets a little bit more complicated, some of the arts. So this is really across the board. Now, some areas have changed, more rapidly than others. Some of them, notably in the humanities, are still really having a lot of kind of tiresome internal debates and hand-wringing about the legitimacy of certain kinds of scholarship that's enabled in the digital world. The social scientists have, in some sense, reached paradise, but also in terms of the incredible amounts of data about the behavior of the population that are available, but also moved into some very dodgy territory because so much of that data is proprietary and non-repeatable. You think of the collaborations that some social scientists have done with organizations like Facebook, where they've used a proprietary platform and data coming out of it to try and gain insight into research problems, but this is not kind of easily repeatable or replicable in the classic kind of ways one thinks about documenting scholarship. So, as I give you examples of things here, think very broadly. So the first thing that I want to just recognize is the growing complexity of a great deal of scholarship. It used to be an awful lot of this was the work of single individuals or one faculty member and a cluster of graduate students working with that investigator. Now, particularly for many of the most difficult and interesting problems, you see these amazing multidisciplinary teams that are being gathered. And these are not just multidisciplinary teams, they are teams that are scattered across multiple institutions and indeed across multiple nations. When you look at some of the issues around environmental science, climate change, public health, all kinds of things of this nature, these are intrinsically large team science. Even within a discipline, take particle physics, look at the army of people that are involved in the operation and exploitation of something like the Large Hadron Collider. I mean, that's a central resource that is being handled collaboratively by an enormous number of people working in that field. You actually run into questions now about what does it even mean to talk about scholarly outcome on there? You have, papers with potentially 1,000 authors. How do you think about, what that means for credit and how to characterize the contributions of individual participants in that? So this kind of complexity is really a significant change. It also means that the results and the methods and things like that become very complicated and multidisciplinary. I mean, one of the truly astounding stories, which I've been following over the last 20 or 30 years, is trying to understand where did AIDS come from and how did it really get loose in the world. And this is a tale that involves understanding transportation networks in colonial and post-colonial Africa, public health, historical medical records, how viruses transfer across species, anthropology, sociology, trying to trace back the evolution of the virus retrospectively over several hundred years and doing the simulated evolution on it. If you look at the disciplines that contributed to trying to unravel that story, which was a very, very important and significant public health issue that really made a difference to society. That's an astounding cross-disciplinary participation to gain those insights. Indeed, at the fringes of this sort of thing now, we have crowdsourced science, the sort of thing that people like Tim Gowers in mathematics are doing, where they collectively work a problem on what's essentially a public blog. Very, very, interesting kind of developments. Next big change, the increasing mediation of information technology. So much of what scholars are doing now integrally involves the computer. And I don't mean just, they're using computers to search the internet or search the literature or write their paper. I mean computational and statistical analysis, simulation, various kinds of sensors and understanding output of sensors that has a lot of computational processing intrinsically in the loop. Now, that, among other things, means that the software needs to be right. And one of the things that we don't know how to do is write correct software. We know how to do our best to get the bugs out of it, especially over time. And there are approaches like open sourcing software that, at least in some cases, gets a lot of eyes on the problem. But we really can't prove correctness of large, complex systems. We're a long way from being able to do that. So you're constantly teetering a little bit on this foundation about what if there's a problem in the hardware or in the statistical packages you use, or maybe even you wrote some of your own software and you didn't quite get it right. And how does that affect your results? And when someone finds the bug, how do you walk the cat back? How do you say, oh, okay, now these series of conclusions need to be adjusted to back this out? And, there have been some very, very serious consequences as bugs have come to light and people have said, oh, yeah, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that clinical trial after all. We have a bad dosing error going on here. Maybe this economic intervention wasn't so brilliant after all. You can point at a number of examples of that in the literature. And, we are becoming, I think, more realistic about this, but this means that an important part of scholarship is managing software corrections, error discovery, software evolution. Now, this also means that if you want to take a snapshot and be able to explain, how did I get this result? You're talking about characterizing a very complex environment here, because it may include your software, it may include 14 levels of different public domain or open source libraries that everybody relies on. Under there is an operating system with an arsenal of packages and things that are constantly being updated in a tricky interdependent way. And then there's the hardware. You may not realize this, but every now and again somebody really messes up with hardware too and ships machines that don't add quite correctly under certain circumstances and things like that, and then everybody has to scurry around and fix that, but that does happen. So the question of simply documenting this has become, much less managing it on an evolutionary kind of a basis, has become an immense challenge in many areas of scientific and scholarly work. Recently, we are seeing fascinating developments here where people will literally capture the entire environment in which they're doing a computation in a virtual machine. And they will put the whole virtual machine environment as sort of supplementary data to a paper. And you're actually seeing these things show up as supplementary data that's submitted with conference papers. Now, virtual machine is a good-sized, complicated data set, and nobody totally understands what it means to curate these across time. I mean, right now, yes, there's some work going on with containers and tools like Docker, but a great deal of this is still kind of semi-proprietary. There are 2 or 3 major software packages in this area. But this is clearly a coming thing. There's big data. Certainly, you've all read some of these, sort of scare articles about the volumes of data coming out of these hero science projects like the Synoptic Sky Survey or, the Large Hadron Collider, things like that, that are generating, flows that are measured in petabytes per unit time, weeks, months, overnight. And we face the problems of how we manage this and where to put it. And how long to keep it, frankly, because these things are big enough that they're expensive to keep. But, just to give you a little bit of a reality check on that, there are certainly these hero projects, but these are mostly really big projects with really big price tags attached to them and major information and data management groups attached to the work and funded as part of the work. So I can assure you that CERN has an enormous staff of people who are doing IT and data management support as part of the Large Hadron Collider effort. In fact, they went and built out themselves a very nice worldwide network to distribute this stuff around for analysis. Things are a little bit different in some of the other sciences. One of the things that's very problematic now is that we've gotten awfully good at sequencing genomes and doing it quite cheap. And so basically, any researcher can go out and get themselves machinery for, a couple $100,000. I mean, this is no longer a $100 million exercise, and generate huge amounts of data. It's very uncertain about how long you really need to keep a good deal of this data. We're, kind of working the balance now between when do you recompute it, or resequence it, when do you keep it. Fascinating issues that are showing up there. But most data is not on that scale, thank heavens. Nonetheless, significant amounts of data are very much part and parcel of research in everything now, including the humanities. Think of the work that, now, it is true that in the humanities, frequently these really larger data sets are kind of community resources. So you look at this work that's going on, for example, in what some people are calling culturomics, where they are analyzing various aspects of the literature base that's represented in HathiTrust, and trying to understand how various concepts and figures of speech rise and fall over the course of time. Fascinating stuff. But that's not a sort of private database that belongs to one researcher. It's a shared resource, and the community struggles with the right kinds of support arrangements and sustainability arrangements to sustain these shared resources. We have now people who are doing exquisite documentation of architectural and archaeological sites with this very fine laser mapping. So our ability to capture and model pieces of the built environment and then to do things like speculatively rebuild them is really becoming quite amazing. I invite you to take a look at some of the work that people like Bernie Fischer are doing, where he's reconstructing ancient Rome, basically. And he's starting from, the departure points of the ruins that are left, plus the descriptions in images and texts of what was there. Building these amazing computer reconstructions. The next step in this is going to be, you're going to see merging of reconstruction of the built environment with what we know about societies and behavior. So once you reconstruct Rome, you can ask questions about Well, how did they distribute food through the city? How did crowds flow through the city? What were the traffic patterns? Very, very kind of interesting questions that bring together, different kinds of simulation and data collections. Okay, so we've talked about some of the changes that are happening inside the fields of scholarship. Let's talk about a few of the external pressures. So, the first one is around public access to research that is funded through public granting agencies, like in the States, the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, the National Endowment for the Humanities, IMLS, those kinds of folks. There's a very basic argument which says your tax dollars are paying for this research, and it would be kind of nice if you could see the outcomes. And you really want to take this down to compelling cases. You look at people who have got a disease that may be life-threatening, that they or a child or a family member is trying to figure out what to do with. The government is spending, $3 billion a year trying to research treatments and cures for this, and you can't see any of the latest research. Well, this is crazy. And when it's explained to Congress that way, through the testimony of some of these folks who desperately need access to this, even Congress gets it and says, this is crazy. And after a really long process now, we have a series of mandates that have been put in place by most of the federal funding agencies. And there are parallel developments that, I'll just note without going into any detail, that are taking place around the globe. They're happening in England. They're happening in the European Union-funded science. They're happening in parts of Asia to some extent. But basically, these put in place requirements that talk about the necessity of providing public access to research outcomes within a very finite and specific amount of time after those research outcomes are produced. And they use the term research outcome fairly broadly. Right now, the specifics are primarily around journal articles, and although they are less specific because it's still an emerging area, around data sets that are a product of federally funded research. Now, to date, they have not really addressed the issue of software. Partially, I would say, because software seems to be less of a problem. A great deal of the software that's coming out of research is open source. It's already up on GitHub or someplace, and there seems to be less of a real problem there, although it's an issue. Very interestingly, everybody has shied away from the question of, well, what about monographs? Those are not much of an issue in science or medicine, and you know that when you look at where the research dollars go, they're mostly in NSF, DOD, NIH is, of course, the biggest. They are not in the National Endowment for the Humanities or the National Endowment for the Arts. But this is, at some point we are going to have to grapple with this. It's also very interesting that when you actually talk to most working scholars in the scientific disciplines, they're very comfortable with the idea of open access around journals. I mean, it's not necessarily they'll go to a great deal of trouble to make it happen, but they're at least philosophically good with the idea that people around the world, anybody who's interested, should be able to, read their publications. The level of comfort around this in the humanities, which is very deeply ingrained around the gatekeeping of scholarly presses, many of whom are in very precarious financial condition, and the sort of publishing-driven models that surround the monograph, I would say there's much less consensus about that. I mean, there's a sort of a vague agreement that ultimately things should end up open access. When it goes out of print, they should get the backlist up on the net for people. But certainly in the conversations I've had with humanities scholars, I would say there is much less of a consensus of views there. But this is a big push now, and basically, this is not optional. These are terms and conditions that you agree to when you take money from these funding sources, and the funding sources are increasingly following up on this and saying, well, we're going to give you and your university a hard time if you don't do what you said you're going to do and what you agreed to do when you took this last grant. You have to take it seriously, and universities are now thinking hard about how do we help our researchers and investigators comply with these mandates. And it's a significant challenge, by the way. We can get into some of the details of why this is so complicated later, but maybe in discussion. But I just note that that's a significant problem. There's a second issue that is surfacing. Most seriously, I would say, in the life sciences, but actually it's larger than that across the board, and that's one of reproducibility. There are an awful lot of well-documented situations now where one researcher in one lab has tried to reproduce the experimental results that have been published by another researcher in another lab and haven't been able to do it. Now, there are a lot of reasons why that can happen. One reason, of course, the one that is thankfully quite rare, but that everybody dreads, is outright fraud. Somebody's been fabricating data or fabricating results. And that has been, an occasional problem. It has become more serious as science has globalized more, as the kind of cultural norms vary a bit, and as there are just astounding pressures on some of the people in developing countries to get publications, and much less of a set of mechanisms for policing this situation. Because I don't know if you're familiar with this process, but generally, while a journal might reject an article saying, we think you fabricated this result, what they will do, they're not investigatory bodies. They will kick that back to either the host institution or the funding agency to figure out, how to resolve this question. If there's nobody home at the host institution to answer these kinds of things, it just sort of falls on the floor, and maybe this paper gets resubmitted to a less rigorous refereeing process at some other journal. So there are big issues about reproducibility. In the vast majority of cases, by the way, it's not fraud. It's either error, it's bad experimental design or bad design of analysis, or bad statistical framework for the analysis, or it is a failure to adequately communicate the experimental methods, which are quite complex, and particularly in the life sciences, where you're never 100% sure what all the variables are that affect the outcome and that you need to control for. You know, the art of transferring a cell line from one lab to another, or certain kinds of experimental methods is very delicate. And we're seeing some fascinating innovations as you move beyond that generally useless two-paragraph method section to people who actually are building much more significant explanations of their methods, which include video materials and things like that. People are trying to develop common inventories of certain kinds of reagents and cell lines and things like that to improve communication about this. But reproducibility is a big issue. And so there is a growing push to say, when you publish, you need to publish enough so that we can reproduce your work at various levels, whether it's rerunning the experiment that produced the data, or whether it's just rerunning the analysis because we think you used some faulty statistical assumptions or a piece of software with a bug in it. So now the question is, what constitutes, what constitutes adequate documentation? Where does it need to be put? Should it be part of the publication? Should it go into some kind of third-party archive? Is it an institutional responsibility? And how does this interact with the peer review process? Do you need to make this available pre-publication to peer reviewers so that they can try and reproduce the results if they're skeptical? Or do you just have to do it after publication? What do you do when there's an IRB involved and a lot of your raw data is personally identifiable data? Can you even share that with a peer reviewer? So you run into these collisions between the ever-growing emphasis on respecting personal privacy and the demands of reproducibility. Somewhat different than either public access to research outcomes or reproducibility is a great desire on the part of both funders and scholars to see a lot more reuse of data. Collecting data is really expensive and sometimes really intrusive and problematic. And the notion that scholars should be able to build upon each other's data is very appealing. It's very appealing to scholars, and at least some scholars, although there's a certain asymmetry. Yes, I'd love to share your data. That's commonplace here. It's very appealing to funders because it speaks to more rapid scientific or scholarly progress at lower cost, much more payoff for their investment in research. And again, you see these fascinating, kind of tensions between personal data, openness, and reusability showing up here, especially as things like the genomic and precision medicine sorts of initiatives, which are totally driven by big data and data sharing, move forward. Very, very interesting developments. The last thing I'll say about something that sits halfway between being organic and being external is that there are a lot of people who are interested in opening up the process of scholarship more. Historically, it's been very much people closet themselves in their office or their lab or wherever and then ultimately wander out with a set of publications that document their results. And there are people, like the Center for Open Science, who are really thinking about how do we open up the whole process of doing science so that others can insert themselves at various points in your data collection, exploration, and analysis. And people working on related topics can share and interact all the way through the process. And there are people who are vocal advocates of that as being the real future of a lot of scholarship as a, sort of openly collaborative effort. Now, I think personally that you will see, a strain of that coexisting with the people who need to go off and brood for 5 years and don't socialize well and come out with an amazing creative kind of a result. And you're going to see different mixtures of the two in different fields. But it is a development, I think, to be very mindful of. In fact, if I was going to identify one innovation in scholarly communication over the last 20 years or so that's probably had the biggest impact on the diffusion and rate of creation of scientific knowledge, I would nominate the growth of preprint archives like arXiv, which have absolutely short-circuited the getting of new ideas and knowledge out there, and opened up a space for community review that's quite different from the formal, sort of dance of peer review that journals apply, and has really made a huge difference in two dimensions. One is just the rate of diffusion, but the other is the broadening of participation of scholars on the leading edge of their discipline. It used to be there was a small kind of closed circle of people who saw each other all the time and passed around results. And now, people all over the globe who are really good can jump into this cycle and make a difference. So this has been, in my view, a very transformative kind of move. And one can imagine that as this thinking about open science moves forward, that we may see some similar outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about what this means for scholarly communication and how the scholarly record changes. So I've already touched a bit upon the needs to curate and connect data to the sort of traditional published scholarly record. There are a set of discussions that are going on, and these are very difficult discussions, and there's an awful lot of prototypes and very little consensus right now. But there are many people that increasingly believe the sort of scholarly article, which we perfected in 1700 more or less, and have done mild embellishing around ever since, needs to become something quite different, something quite interactive and multidimensional. In the extreme case, something that really contains structured representations of knowledge. Again, in the biomedical field, I see these astounding developments happening out of places like the National Library of Medicine and the National Center for Biotechnology Information, where they are literally ingesting the literature in structured form, and then they are linking it up to various kinds of databases of sequences, expression pathways, signaling pathways, where you get literature that, among other things, much of its impact is making incremental contributions to databases that, as they grow more complete, become incredibly powerful. And that process of, kind of distilling the assertions and findings into things that can be aggregated is something that people are looking for ways to make more explicit. And there are, of course, hard questions about, yeah, well, who puts in all the work to do this structuring? Is this a burden you're going to place on authors? Is it a burden you're going to place on the editorial kinds of activities that publishers do? Is it a post-publication activity that you know, as people like NLM and NCBI are structuring it at the moment? Nobody's really quite sure of the answer there and how that answer is going to vary from discipline to discipline. But these are very crucial questions as they go forward. It's absolutely clear that we need to connect but separate data from results and analysis, so that the data can be reused and reanalyzed for all the reasons I've been describing. And this is mostly being done, you know, again, it's kind of an incremental process in the sciences. You know, people are realizing that graph or table in a journal article is not adequate. You need the underlying data. Yes, the graph is a helpful, you know, communication mechanism for getting the idea across, but people really need the underlying data set. The graph is not enough, and you need to supply that and provide the link. It's much more interesting in the humanities, where people are really struggling with what this means. And let me just give you, you know, two examples. So one of the poster children of the debate around is digital humanities legitimate scholarship was the work of Ed Ayers and Will Thomas back some years ago now in the Valley of the Shadows. Now, what they did is they built a very elaborate database of documentation, which they were using in their teaching, that basically looked at communities in one state on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, and trying to understand the various social, economic, and other structural differences that the legality of slavery made before the Civil War. And they produced this database, and their students did a lot of work in building up the database, and they used it extensively in their teaching as a body of evidence. But they were very clear that this is evidence, and there's a difference between amassing evidence and producing analysis. And they wrote a wonderful article that provided their analysis of this for, I don't know I forget what journal. It was the Journal of the American Historical Society. I forget what its name is. Which, you know, was a very elaborate journal with links from many points in it to specific parts of this evidentiary database. So now what you have here in the humanities and social sciences all of a sudden is this notion of evidence that can travel separately and be re-examined and reinterpreted from the analysis. Now, let me give you another example, which I'm spending some time on, quite a bit of time thinking about, along with my colleague Michael Buckland at Berkeley and a few other folks. So Michael has been looking at the editorial practices of documentary editors. So this is a niche of the universe that's very interesting. You discover that they produce these things that go on for like 40, 50 years at vast expense and, you know, encapsulate entire scholarly careers producing the collected papers of the founding fathers, for example. So somebody's working on a 1 million volume, edition of Jefferson's, writings with extensive footnotes and explaining, who all the people mentioned in there are and this sort of thing. And these are big projects. He worked with one that was looking at the life of contributions of Emma Goldman, for example, which is housed at Berkeley. So it turns out what these people do is they basically build databases, although only in more recent years have they actually built even, cheapy databases. Before that, they built file cards aplenty. And basically, they wind up documenting super detailed biographies of these people, where they were every day of their working lives and what were they doing and who were they talking to and this kind of thing and what did they publish. And then they got to amass the best editions of the various publications and connect all that stuff up. So these are incredible scholarly resources for anybody who's doing further work on that or an adjacent author. Particularly with the founding fathers, these people all interacted heavily and talked to each other and things like that. But every one of them's got one of these little independent databases, and guess what they do? When the project's over and that last volume's out, I put it in a box someplace and it goes in a basement, and 10 years later someone throws it away. This practice is not unique to documentary editing. Historians do this. Biographers do it. All kinds of folks do this. So I think one of the great emergent challenges in the humanities is how we pull these things, how we take something like biography, which is a subjective work that typically includes a lot of speculation about mental states, intellectual development, artistic or political contributions, things like that. That's part of the interpretive work of a biographer. But underlying that, there's a scaffolding of facts, or not necessarily, absolute immutable facts, but at least assertions that they believe based on some piece of evidence. And, many biographers will freely admit that despite their best efforts, they're left with these, lacunae and contradictions in people's lives as they write biographies. We have some evidence that the person was doing this and some evidence that the person was doing that, and we'll probably never know unless additional evidence comes to light. How amazing would it be if we could curate and build and share this kind of substrate of assertions separately from the analysis? And, that's one of the vectors that I at least see that's going to be very important for the humanities in the next 10 or 20 years. And I think needs to be very tied up with conversations about what's the genuine future for the descendants of the monograph in the digital world, as opposed to, I made a PDF of my book, which is useful but has its obvious limits. Software, I've already talked about a little bit, but that's obviously going to be an integral part of the scholarly record. And we actually are very confused about what does it mean to preserve software as opposed to maintain software. Does it mean that we can run it in some sort of environment that captures, the platform as it was at the time? Or does it mean we have the source code so we could try and port it into current environments? Or does it mean somebody's actively maintaining this and fixing documented problems? All of these things come into play when we speak of preserving software, and I think that really understanding the different nuances and purposes of that is going to become a major challenge. And I just want to flag two other things here. Software is not just a tool for scholarship, but software actually characterizes a tremendous amount of our experience as people today, the various interfaces that software present. Think about the size of the video game industry, the number of hours per year. that people in this country spend on video games or on Facebook. Now, ask the question, what does it genuinely mean to document World of Warcraft as it existed in 2012 or Facebook as it existed in late 2014? You certainly can't store the whole system. You could take some video and give people some sense of what it was like to interact with it, but you really can't just put away the whole system. So this question of how we capture at least some record or some sense of what was it like to use things in the past is really important. And we have very little idea how to do it. In fact, the things we have in place are getting real shaky. So Brewster Kahle, one of the great visionaries of our time, ignored all the reasons why you couldn't do it and started capturing the web very early on at scale. And he's the only reason we have much of a sense of what that looked like, other than a few screenshots. But if you talk to him today, he will tell you that increasingly you're not capturing static pages, you're capturing these things that dynamically amass data from 14 different directions and run interactive things and do various kinds of customizations based on who it thinks you are and your previous interaction history and your demographics and heaven knows what else. How do you really capture that? And they're honestly struggling as more and more of the web moves in that direction. People don't see the same web. You get 3 people to sign on to the New York Times site at the same time, and they'll see 3 different things. What does that mean about documenting news in the future? Think about how central that is as a resource. So, we've got lots of issues around software and software-enabled things of various kinds. So, I want to just conclude with a couple of observations about where libraries get into this. There are, as I've indicated, some very complicated challenges around curation, reuse, providing a whole infrastructure of documentation, storage, and appraisal, frankly, because you're going to want to make decisions over a period of time about, you may say, we're going to keep a lot of stuff for 10 years or 5 years, because most of the replicability issues show up in the fairly short term. The edge of science moves on. The edge of various kinds of methods move on. How do you come back and decide 10 years later what deserves to stay around for the longer term and what doesn't? We have no idea how to do this, but somebody's going to have to manage that process, and it's obviously going to be a mixture of scholars in the disciplines and various curatorial folks, probably mostly based in either the library or certain kinds of disciplinary organizations. In biomedicine, for example, you are seeing certainly national organizations like NCBI and NIH getting very serious about these kinds of questions across the disciplines they support. So you actually are going to have this interplay of disciplinary-based initiatives and institutionally-based initiatives. My guess is, given the nature and the scattered kind of funding that characterizes the humanities and some of the social sciences, that you're going to see a tremendous amount more institutionally based dependence around those fields. Whereas, if you think of something like planetary science, NASA's kind of on top of that and has some very well-established systems that support the community and practices around data sharing and reuse there. Similarly, in certain kinds of astronomy and high-energy physics and things like that. But this whole question about how we deal with the research data management problem, and I think it's really important to think about it as the research data management life cycle and challenge not to formulate it as a problem of digital preservation. It's much more complicated than that because it gets at why are we doing this, and it gets at making choices about when we should be doing things and for how long. And this is going to, I think, become particularly challenging because if you have a lot of resources, the more resources you have, the easier it gets because the less competitive and rigorous your criteria for allocating resources need to be. And in fact, it looks to me at least like the mismatch between demand and or need and available resources right now is going to be quite large for the foreseeable future. So we really need to think about, how to deal with some of these in what I'd characterize as almost like near triage environments. How can we do the best we can, not what's the perfect thing to do if we had infinite resources? That's a relatively easy question. The other thing I just want to call out in closing is the notion of corpora of scholarship as themselves objects of computation. The whole idea of being able to compute on knowledge bases of text and other materials is very much stepping to the forefront. And the idea, for example, of being able to fuse new knowledge you're creating with the existing base of knowledge and understanding how it changes that base, how it connects up to what is and isn't known, how to reuse disparate discoveries in that base is becoming very important. We have some very interesting technologies that are developing quite rapidly in this area, but they are tremendously blocked by the kind of stovepiping that our historical publishing system has done, where you may find key journals from in a given discipline from a half a dozen or more publishers. And yes, each publisher may say, yeah, we'll work out some arrangements where you can data mine, but they'll do their own idiosyncratic silo. So the ability to genuinely think about the corpora of literature and knowledge in a discipline is emerging as a massive challenge. In some narrow disciplines, a lot has been done. Astrophysics is a very interesting poster child here with the astrophysical data system and the way they have kind of taken a literature and underlying data and packaged it together in a fairly comprehensive way. But other broader, older disciplines, very, very tough problem. I actually co-chaired a study panel for the National Academies a couple of years ago, looking at the prospects of building a global digital library of the mathematics literature. And the math literature is funny because people go very deeply into it. If you look at physics, there's a big clustering in the last 10 or 15 years, and then usage trails off into a small tail. Mathematics, people, cite 100-year-old articles all the time. So it's a particularly interesting problem, plus the notational things. But, looking at that really gave me a sense of just how difficult it's going to be to get practically to where we have these text corpora that will realize the promise of the technologies. So I've gone on a long time here, longer than I intended, of course, but I hope I've given you kind of a framework for thinking about some of these developments and how they really emanate from changes in scholarly work and the environment in which it's funded and conducted, and how that's rippling into scholarly communication and the need for a whole rethink of research support services and research communication support services. This is a very rich area, and I think it's going to be very, very interesting to participate in shaping it and watch it evolve. I would welcome questions on things I talked about or things I didn't talk about. And Lorraine told me we have this room for a while, so I would be happy to talk for a while. Thank you.
I'm going to help you moderate, but also ask a question.
Okay.
So, Cliff, one of the things that seems challenging is that there is an increasing grassroots effort to provide locations to consolidate or offer places for people to put papers, data, and perhaps the actual code associated with its analysis. And there seem to be popping up in a grassroots sort of community effort, as well as commercialized alternatives touting why that's a better choice for them. So the faculty, in the face of this trend, are getting a huge range of options with very little information to differentiate. What would help someone be, or what should someone be thinking about when considering this plethora of choice?
Okay, that's a great question, and let me give you several answers to it. The first thing I would say is, as anyone using any of these dissemination vehicles, eschew exclusive arrangements. You want to maintain the rights and the ability to put things lots of places. If your purpose is to get your information out so that people can find it, you absolutely don't want to be limited to one venue. The world can change in very unexpected ways. Some of these commercial services may just decide this isn't profitable. Some of the grassroots efforts may prove to be unsustainable. Sometimes just plain old surprising stuff happens. Elsevier taking out SSRN the other month. Nobody would have thought of that when they were using SSRN as their primary vehicle. So having lots of alternatives and the freedom to exercise lots of alternatives is really critical. Second off, be clear about what problem you're trying to solve. If you're talking about getting your work discovered and found and read, then you need to think about where is your audience. And it may be that a good deal of your audience is in one of these commercial venues or grassroots venues. So that's a great place to put your stuff on a non-exclusive basis. If you're trying to satisfy your funders' requirements around public access, those are not written in such a way as they say, just pick some place where you think the public can find it and put it there, or just publish it in an open access journal and that's good enough. They actually are very prescriptive, and often now they are speaking about various kinds of archives or repositories that the federal government runs, whether it's the Department of Energy's, Pages, or the PubMed system that NIH and NLM operate. So if you're actually, trying to satisfy funder requirements, you need to be sure that a copy of your stuff ends up in there. And none of the funder requirements are written in an exclusive way. They're all, fine, you want to publish it somewhere else, put it somewhere else, that's fine. Just don't confuse it with meeting the funder requirement. Now, there are some very nuanced things here where I think faculty are going to need a lot of help from folks like the library teams at their institutions. Because let's take the case of biomed stuff. So most of that stuff needs to end up in PubMed. And in fact, while all the NIH-funded stuff has to end up in there, they've also made it very clear that things that are produced with NSF funding that are within scope are very welcome in there, and they'd like that because they're trying to build as comprehensive as possible a corpus. Now, if you publish in certain kinds of open access journals, or some journals that have article processing charges where you can buy your article into openness, what they will do is either for everything published in there or for everything where you indicate there was NIH funding, they will automatically feed that stuff in bulk feeds into PubMed. So for example, if you publish in PLOS or Proceedings of the National Academy, these things will get where you want to go, where you need to go. But knowing as a faculty member that I'm NIH funded, but if I publish here, that will take care of my requirements for public access automatically, but also realizing that, oh, there's this other open access journal over here, I could publish in there, but they don't do the automatic feed into PubMed. That's a nasty, subtle distinction for a busy researcher to understand. So you need to be very clear about what you're doing. Similarly, when you talk about putting data sets up, are you really trying to ensure that these will be available in the short run, or that someone's going to take long-term stewardship responsibility for that? And if it's the latter, you better trust the organization that's doing it has the resources and the will to do it, which usually is going to mean either an institution, a university, or maybe one of the big funders, or maybe some kind of self-sustaining third party, perhaps backstopped by a university. People make this terrible error, and you see it on all levels, from consumer-based stuff all the way through scholars, of thinking that just because somebody gives me a place where I can put my stuff to be found and downloaded and reused, they're making a commitment to preserve it in the long run, to keep it available, and to maintain its integrity. And we've seen that even with things like photo sites, where they've just decided, oh, we think we'll recode all this stuff as, JPEG 2000 because it saves space. And yeah, it makes a bit of artifacting here and there, but hey, it was free, what were you expecting? Doesn't make you feel very good if, those are really important documentation of scientific research. So I would provide those bits of advice. Having said that, let's be real. Most researchers don't have time to answer those questions very thoroughly, and guidance you can give them that is, specific to their discipline and timely and succinct and kept up to date is really, really important.
Questions?
Hi, I'm Beth Dodd. I'm the curator of the Alexander Architectural Archive. And most recently, I have seen more of a change in library practices moving towards archival practices, primarily because of the massive amounts of material that we have to manage and document and make preserve and make accessible. And one question I have is just a sliver about one of those areas of managing the recent past and making that more accessible, where we're hogtied by copyright, where we've put a lot of work into digitization, but we don't have the bandwidth to identify copyright. And I'm wondering what your feelings are about mitigating this through takedown notices.
So this is very interesting. I mean, first to speak to the broader point of archival practice in libraries, that has been really interesting to watch as the sort of common commodity collections move to the cloud, and we see, community-wide structures like the keepers organizations coming in, things like clocks and Portico to deal with the long-term preservation and curation of the, kind of bulk journal literature. So the libraries are increasingly both being invited to engage and being left with the really hard one-off kind of stuff of exactly the sort that you described that is so increasingly important to scholarly work. There are a couple of approaches to this. I do know, and the bad news is that unless we get some rational copyright legislation, and I'm not holding my breath, it's a risk analysis. And I think that universities tend to be fairly risk-adverse creatures, but university libraries, when they've been bold and have been able to do it, have actually had darn good success with handling takedown notices and just, dealing with it that way. Brewster kind of led the way on that. He gets a certain number of requests for takedown and deals with them, and life goes on. In many cases, that's literally the only alternative you have. I look at, for example, some of the projects that libraries have been doing, digitizing photographs from the latter half of the 20th century, or, UCLA did some amazing stuff where there's this whole kind of obscure genre of Latino, I guess it's jazz sort of music that grew up around the LA area pre-World War II that was mostly done on very small runs of I guess probably 78s in many cases, that were sold out of storefronts in the area. And unlike, for example, the early blues stuff where you had Alan Lomax come and other people come nationally, and try and track those down and building up these huge collections at LC. This stuff had mostly been lost and, was just in a basement at the UCLA library. And the notion of trying to even identify who's on it, much less clear the rights, is hopeless. So they just did exactly that. And, what a treasure that is for the world.
I'm thinking specifically about oral histories where this is providing, the oral histories provide the context and the relationships that our documents don't. And I really am very strongly opinionated about putting these up with a takedown notice, because with the humanities, you really need that. You need to have that context and relationship available for scholarship.
I agree. And, the one thing I would caution, though, is that simply doing an analysis from the viewpoint of copyright is not adequate. You also have a whole bunch of issues around donor agreements, rights of publicity, things like that. And there's a funny property where people may be just fine with this stuff sitting in a physical archive, but when it gets visible, I was just talking with Jeff Mackey Mason at Berkeley recently, and he had an incident where there were some very interesting historical collections of material dealing with Native Americans in California in the early part of the 20th century, and I think these included some oral history kinds of things, although they were transcripts rather than recordings and some other artifacts. And, those had been in there, and scholars had made occasional use of them for years. And they digitized them, and all of a sudden he found himself in the middle of some very complicated controversies because there was considerable disagreement among various segments of the descendants of the people in there about whether it was a wonderful thing that this was all visible or it was wildly inappropriate given the circumstances under which it was collected and the cultural norms. So you need to, kind of think about these things holistically as part of your analysis. The one other thing I want to put on your radar screen, if you haven't run into it yet, which I think is going to be absolutely transformative for a lot of humanities research if it succeeds over the next decade or so, is the SNAC project that Daniel Pitti is running. Basically, what that's going to do is let us find out where that kind of context is, not necessarily things that are by people but are about them or involve them, that are one-off scattered around in archives, and trying to really get that to come into being in a large-scale, sustainable way, I think is hugely important.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm Hannah Cahoon. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the information school.
Okay.
And I actually came here from the Center for Open Science. I worked there before.
Cool.
Yeah. And so you talked about external pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Something, at least that my personal experience has told me, is that there's not a particularly strong internal pressure to participate or even take advantage of open science. I worked on the reproducibility project Psychology, and there was so much fuss following this. And I think that we've gotten one pull request, maybe two, for our data set and analyses. And there's just a surprisingly low amount of engagement in the materials that we put up for people to share. And obviously that's one example, but it was a highly visible one. So I was curious what kind of internal pressures do you think are there now and maybe are needed to increase individual researchers' participation?
That's a great question, and I think there's this good deal of variation from discipline to discipline, and I shouldn't even say discipline because it really goes down to a much more detailed kind of tribal sub-disciplinary level communities around specific things. So I agree that generally there's not a lot of uptake. There are a few very vocal advocates of this in different disciplines. And you do see sometimes real strong interest from graduate students. I think that one of the tricky dynamics there is that there's nothing more intensely conservative than the advice that a typical tenure track assistant professor gets from their various mentors and department chairs and things like that. So there's a terrible, kind of inertia thing around that tenure process. But I think that, some of this is going to be generational. And you've really got to think about a long game here. These kind of cultures don't change in 2 or 3 years, they change in 2 generations. It's really interesting to watch things like the establishment of the legitimacy of digitally intensive work in a field like classics, which is not a big field. And there were a few people who were considered fairly crazed folks, like Greg Crane as a young man, who came into these fields and built things like Perseus. And the main reason they were tolerated was in a field that gets almost no funding. They were bringing down $1 million grants, and that tends to get folks' attention. You'll put up with a lot when you've brought in your only $1 million grant in 10 years. There was a period, and I would guess it was probably in the early mid-2000s, where enough of these sort of outliers had wound up in tenured positions that they became able to have graduate students and write evaluations and references for each other, and it kind of got established as a really legitimate set of practices. But it genuinely took 20 years to do that, and it's still a somewhat incremental process. So expecting that you're going to affect really fast change there is, I think, you'll find pockets of it. You'll find adopters and evangelists and people who get excited, and maybe in some of the best cases, that adopter and evangelist will be, someone who is widely recognized as a field leader, a Nobel Prize winner or someone else very, very visible in the given discipline. The other thing I'd say is that it's really important to point to big wins from doing this. And I think we have had some modest wins, for example, in some of the work that Gowers has been doing in mathematics and his colleagues. We've had, a few wins elsewhere maybe, but we need to identify breakthroughs that wouldn't have happened or would have taken much longer or cost much more, that are being enabled by these kinds of environments and practices, and publicize them, because there's nothing like results to get people excited.
So I'd like to thank Cliff for the time he spent with us and ask you to do the same.
Thank you all.